Hello, this is Dr. Esa and welcome back to God and Money in the Bible. In this last session of the Pentateuch, we're going to be looking at tithing, Sabbath, and holidays and some other laws in the Pentateuch. But let me start with the brief introduction to the remaining legislation concerning social justice and poor in the Pentateuch. Since we have limited time, you can feel free to explore these passages on your own. Legislation concerning boundaries, gleaning, and scrumping can be found in the passages on the screen. And we will look at tithing in just a minute. Also, God is concerned about the proper and just wages and business practices, payment of wages on time, pledges and securities, especially in a way that the poor and the orphan and the widow are not being exploited. Also, generous loans are to be given to the poor without any kind of interests. Also, just weights are important for the proper business practices. God had also granted different holidays and Sabbaths for all the people of Israel for the sake of worshiping God and enjoying God's blessings and provisions. Another important part of the law was the just treatment of everyone. Poor and rich, men and women, young and old were all supposed to have equality before God. Bribery and gift giving was also forbidden in the context of legal disputes so that there would be no distortion of justice. So let's look at briefly the tithing in Pentateuch. Like many of the practices in Mosaic law, tithing was not uniquely practiced in Israelite society. We remember how Abraham already gave the tithe to the king Melchizedek, and tithing in general was widely practiced in the ancient Near East. Here's a short summary of the tithes that we can find in the Pentateuch. Leviticus 27 specifically tells that all of the Israelites were supposed to give a tithe of grain, fruit, and livestock, and that was supposed to be holy to the Lord. And this was specifically designed to help the priests. So the priests were recipients of the tithes of the Israelites. So all of the increase and the blessing that God gave them, they were supposed to give 1/10 to the priests. We hear of another tithe in Numbers chapter 18, where the Levites are the recipients of the tithes. Now, obviously, both the priests and the Levites were supposed to get a livelihood from somewhere because they did not own or have any land. The peculiar thing about Numbers 18 is that as the Levites received tithes from the Israelites, out of that tithe, they're supposed to give another tithe, or obviously their first tithe, to the priests. We hear other regulation concerning tithing in Deuteronomy 12, where the tithe of the Israelites were supposed to be consumed in Jerusalem. So as they made the pilgrimage feast or otherwise went to Jerusalem, Israelites were supposed to enjoy God's abundant blessing and spent the money basically on themselves, and obviously to include the Levites and the more vulnerable groups into the feasting. Deuteronomy chapter 14 adds to that if people had a lot to transport with them in forms of tithing, they could convert it into money for easy transport and then spend the money in Jerusalem celebrating God's blessing together with the Levite. Finally, Deuteronomy 14 verses 28 and 29 and also 26 talks about what is called the third year tithe. In other words, every third year in that 7-year cycle, as Israelites gave their tithes, they were supposed to be stored in towns and specifically given to the vulnerable people, the Levite, the poor, the widow and the orphan and the alien. So let me read that scripture for you. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithes of your produce in the same year and laid up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands that you do. So according to Deuteronomy 14, the tithe was supposed to be given to the vulnerable groups every third year. So as opposed to the normal practice, the tithe was stored in cities and not taken to Jerusalem. It was specifically given to those who do not have land. So in addition to Levites, also the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And they were kept in storehouses. Presumably, the poor would be provided probably until the next triennial tithe. So this is the amount of provision that was gathered that it would actually last for the 3 years. Notice also that the tithe is removed. It's holy, it's solemn declaration, and it's a sacred obligation for God's people to give the tithe every year, but every third year specifically to the vulnerable groups. And obviously, as before, as God's people give, God has promised to bless them. As we saw, the Pentateuch actually talks about tithing in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. A question inevitably arose whether one is supposed to give 1, 2, or 3 tithes, since tithing is mentioned several times. So both the modern and the ancient interpreters have been perplexed about the specific legislation regarding tithing. The ancient rabbis considered that 2 tithes would be required of Israelites. One would go for the Levites and the priests, and the second tithe would be consumed by the Israelites in Jerusalem. The exception was the third year, when the tithe was supposed to be given to the vulnerable groups instead of being consumed in Jerusalem. Other Jewish teachers and interpreters, on the other hand, considered that Israelites should give 3 tithes every year. For example, Book of Tobit and Josephus have this opinion. Modern scholars tend to think that there was only 1 tithe that was involved, and that each law was exemplary and not comprehensive in its scope. Obviously, when one starts to think about the applicability of this law for present-day purposes, whether for the Jewish or Christian practice, it is quite difficult to equate tithe as a simple 10% of one's income. It may be a good pragmatic advice to give 10% of one's income to the Lord. However, the legislation in Pentateuch does not reflect that sort of a practical abstraction. At the very least, if one takes these legislation as guide-giving or mandatory, one should at least give the third part of the tithe to the vulnerable group, since the entire tithe every third year went to the poor and the orphan and the widow and the Levite. What we can see in these passages is definitely God's concern for his work, his glory, and specifically for the vulnerable groups that receive the tithe every third year. God is not just concerned about his glory and holiness, though that is important, but he's also very much interested in maintaining justice and righteousness in the land. So let's look at next weekly Sabbath and annual holidays. Those of us who work in the Western world are so accustomed to holidays that we don't even think about it. However, the weekly Sabbath and the provision for holidays were probably one of the most unique things for the people of God, as opposed to those who live in the surrounding nations. A work week that included 6 days plus 1 day Sabbath was completely unprecedented. The Sabbath legislation in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy gives us a glimpse of that. Obviously, as we know, Sabbath was based on the weekly routine that was in itself based on creation. So 6 days of work plus 1 day of holiday. And during this day of Sabbath rest, everyone was supposed to enjoy God's blessing. This included the resident alien, slaves, and the animal. And the Sabbath was not an option for the Israelite. In fact, if one did not obey the Sabbath commandment, one risked God's judgment. God had already also had given his people festivals in forms of annual holidays. These were whole community celebrations where all were supposed to come and rejoice and enjoy God's blessing in a form of joyful worship and meal. During the 3 mandatory pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem, during first fruits, weeks, and booths, the Israelites were supposed to bring the produce that they had garnered from their fields for community celebration. They were to include the orphan and the widow, the poor, the Levites, and also the servants, so that the whole community would be celebrating. Some of these festivals lasted for several days, and these were not parties for the rich, but Israelites were commanded specifically to include the vulnerable groups in their holidays. Again, we can see that without these God-given provisions, the poor and the vulnerable groups would be working or would be excluded. However, God had given a special provision so that all the community were supposed to enjoy God's blessing in joyful celebration and worship of God. I think the legislation concerning the Sabbath and the annual holidays is a great reminder for all of us in today's world as well. Some are overworked and stressed out. For them, Sabbath laws and annual holidays is a great reminder of the alternating pattern of work and leisure and holiday. There should be rest and moderation, since God has promised to take care of his people. On the other hand, there are so many people in today's world that do not have any work. In that sense, Sabbath is a call for justice and righteousness, so that those who do not have work would be provided labor that gives them dignity and worth in God's sight and among God's people. In addition, the festivals remind us that God's people are one. They're supposed to be able to worship together and joyfully come before the Lord. And all of God's people are supposed to be able to share in his blessing and joyfully worship him. And nobody is supposed to be excluded or left on the wayside.